this is going to be great.
Leave it on the podium for everyone.
I left it on the podium now, sorry.
Good, good.
And
Will you be ringing the bell? Oh, it's been the bell ringing. Nothing.
Bell or any ring.
So to signify the beginning of the march signal, we
Yes.
have the speaker ring a bell there, which is from the USS Bear,
Oh, fabulous.
from the Cutter Bear.
Fabulous. Oh, then yes, I'll be ringing the bell.
So you'll be ringing the bell? Yes.
August 7th.
Oh, he's here all the time. He rings the bell.
Thanks very much. That'd be great. Love it. But I don't want this from Lieutenant Colonel.
all right.
I said he should ring the bell, but Paul, if you'd like
Yeah,
to.
no, this is for you.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Okay.
Are we all set?
I think we're all set.
Louise.
Can we ring the bell?
As soon as Steve gives us the...
Yes.
All right. Yeah, let's do it.
Check, 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 check. Check, check. Check, check.
Perfect. Perfect.
What do you do in Madagascar? I was doing operational support for Centrum Albino and for expeditions.
Only water allowed in the cart room.
here we are. Good evening, and welcome to the Explorers Club. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tangy, and on behalf of the Explorers Club Public Lectures Committee Chair, Natalie Cash, who's here this evening, and our President, Richard Garriott, I would like to start by thanking you all for joining us here tonight. Since 1902, our club has come together to form a community promoting the scientific exploration of land, sea, air, and space. And since 1922, every Monday night, we've gathered for a public lecture as part of our core mission of science, education, and service. Your presence here tonight makes you a part of that community, and your support tonight makes this tradition possible. And so for that, we thank you. Please raise your hand if this is your first time in the Explorers Club tonight. Wonderful. Welcome. You belong here. And then please raise your hand if you're an Explorers Club member. Also welcome. Okay, to order a drink at the bar downstairs afterwards. Those of you who raised your hand for your first time, please find an Explorers Club member to bring you as a guest. Here's our plan for tonight. In just a moment, I'll introduce our two speakers, and then a little bit differently, one of our speakers is calling in remotely, and so the presentation is going to switch back and forth between being in person here in the room and then a remote speaker up there. And then we'll take questions at the end. This will go for about an hour. But first, we have some special guests here tonight that I would like to begin by welcoming. So first, have we got any members of the Explorers Club Military Veterans Initiative that came tonight? Very good. Thank you for being here and for the... and for the other members of the initiative who are calling in online, thank you for your efforts to steward the club's military-connected legacy and support our military-connected and veteran members with events like here tonight. I also want to thank the personnel from New York City Fleet Week. So if you're from Fleet Week, can you please stand up? All right. For the past 3 years, the Military and Veterans Initiative in the club has organized a Fleet Week event, including last week's visit to His Majesty's ship Scott, named for one of our earliest members. So tonight with us here are members of the Fleet Week, the Coast Guard, we've got some Coasties here, the United States Navy, and the United States Marine Corps. And for the Devil Dogs, we put some extra crayons out in the bar downstairs for you. I'd also like to thank my West Point classmate, Sam Saray, for being here, and I'd like to welcome as a special guest recently retired Command Sergeant Major Matthew Reed up here in the front right corner. 2 decades ago, Matt, as a team leader, kept a young second lieutenant me alive in Iraq, and today he's a trusted friend. He knows how much tonight's lecture means to me, and he flew in from North Carolina to attend this in support. That kind of decades-long faith, born of the crucible of service, is exactly what brings us here tonight. I'd also like to welcome Annette Ammerman from the a distinguished naval historian and an expert in Marines and polar exploration, who has also come to join us here tonight. So tonight is our club's inaugural. Yeah, I have to say it right. Tonight is our club's inaugural Memorial Day public lecture, and it's fitting that we do this. Our club originated in the community formed by survivors of the U.S. Army's Lady Franklin Bay expedition. And honoring the 19 American soldiers lost in service to the country on that expedition was surely part of why this club was formed. Today, as the club continues its mission as a meeting place for explorers to promote the scientific discovery of land, sea, and air, we can and should proudly join in this national holiday of Memorial Day, remembering those lost in armed service by specifically remembering the lost who were explorers. From the ordinary crew members like Sergeant Joseph Ellison, the last to die from Greely's expedition, whose grandson recently visited this club headquarters, to the legendary astronaut Lieutenant Colonel Ed White, buried at West Point next to his brother Major James White, James went missing in action in Vietnam in 1969, 2 years after his brother was lost on Apollo 1. And an interesting connection to tonight's lecture, James White was buried at West Point alongside his brother 50 years later in 2018, after investigators from the Defense POW and Accounting Agency recovered his remains and brought them home, just like the Marines that were found by Expedition Flag Number 146. So, Flag Number 146, we are honored to be joined tonight by two stalwart explorers from our Atlanta chapter, Harry Brooks and Bob Carlson. Harry first. A pilot and a lawyer, Harry was elected Fellow of the Explorers Club in 1993, and he received the Sweeney Medal in 2011. He has served the club as a director for 6 years, including a fascinating story of being here in the city on 9/11 for a board meeting. He was the Atlanta chapter chair for 4 years. He's been the chair of several committees, including Flag and Honors, Legal, Nominating, Membership, and he's served the club as the ombudsman. He's carried flags on expeditions to Papua New Guinea, Rotan Honduras, Belize, Tarawa, Midway, Bonaire, Easter Island, and twice to the Peruvian Amazon. We're also joined by Bob Carlson, a member of the Explorers Club since 1997, a diver and a lawyer, a NAUI instructor, trained in Trimex and cave diving, who has participated in several Explorers Club expeditions around the world, often alongside Harry. Before they begin, they've asked me to set the stage by providing an overview of the Carlson'S Raiders in the Battle of Makin Island. So tonight's lecture is about their expedition, Flag 146, not about the battle, but I'm going to tell you 10 things to know about the battle to set the stage. So, with that, and there we go. 1942, America is reeling from the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, preparing to counterattack against the Japanese in Guadalcanal. To divert Japanese resources from defending Guadalcanal, a strategic raid is planned against Makin Island. And there is Makin Island. Assumed to be a major Japanese position in the Gilberts and Marshall Islands. Spoiler, it wasn't. A second objective was U.S. public morale by showing the U.S. that the U.S. could strike back at the Japanese on Japanese-held territory just 7 months after Pearl Harbor. Enter Evans Carlson, a New Yorker described by author Edgar Snow as, quote, something you don't see every day in the Marines. He was a high school dropout who lied about his age to enlist in the Army at age 16. Within 3 years, he was a sergeant major. Then he became an officer during World War I. Afterwards, he left the Army, tried to come back. The Army said no thanks, and so he enlisted as a private in the Marines. The Marines made him an officer again, where he eventually befriended Franklin Roosevelt and his son James, before going to China as an observer of his friend Mao Zedong, pictured here with him. He resigned from the Marines again to advocate for what he called Gung Ho, working together in harmony, a radical approach to military organization inspired by the communist forces that he fought with. It called for eliminating distinctions between officers and enlisted men, working together in highly indoctrinated and trained small teams, and making collective decisions through democratic votes from among the team members. He also fell in intellectually with New York City's own Colonel Wild Bill Donovan, who received the Medal of Honor for leading the Fighting 69th during World War I, and by World War II was leading the Office of Strategic Services, forerunner of the CIA. Donovan pushed the government to embrace strategic actions by small groups of highly trained and often clandestine forces, also known as commandos. This led to Carlson's selection to lead a strategic raid on Makin Island, essentially the first special operations conducted by the U.S. military. This picture shows Carlson on the left planning with President Roosevelt's son, James Roosevelt, on the right. Roosevelt was his executive officer. Key to this operation was their covert insertion by submarine. So instead of the black helicopters coming into the middle of the night, in this case, it was 2 submarines navigating 2,029 miles across the open Pacific to arrive at a precise point in time at an off-an-island speck in the middle of the night under radio silence. The two submarines, the USS Nautilus and USS Argonaut, were cruiser-class submarines, largest submarines ever built before the advent of nuclear submarines, with 6-inch deck guns. Still, these were built to carry torpedoes and not assaulting troops. And the miserable conditions among the extra 220 sweaty, unwashed Marines, plus all of their assault equipment, were preludes to the suffering that they were about to encounter. And this is a picture of them embarking on one of their submarines. So after the suffering of the submarines came the surf. August 17th, 1942, at 3:30 in the morning, white caps and 10-foot swells. An elaborate plan to load the boats on the decks and then submerge the subs proved unfeasible. So the rubber boats were lowered and the Marines had to jump down onto them and pray that they didn't miss and fall into the ocean waters weighed down with their gear. There was a planned pincer landing with 2 different landings, and it just turned into a pell-mell everybody for the beach. They landed unopposed but completely disorganized for what was supposed to be a 12-hour raid, and then returned to the submarines at nightfall. But that 12-hour raid turned into a 48-hour ordeal, in the course of which they killed nearly every Japanese defender, but without realizing that they had done so. Once again, their main enemy proved to be the surf, and when they tried to make it back to the subs that first night, only 4 of the small boats made it back. Here's a picture of the small boats trying to make it back to the subs. The other boats were turned over repeatedly in the surfs. Boats, weapons, even clothing was lost. The men straggled back on shore in chaos. Without shelter, weapons, food, or even water, they grew desperate, especially as Carlson was forced to reflect that among the men stranded on the beach was the president's son. 5 men who did make it back to the submarines volunteered to go back through the surf to try to establish communications, and they were able to evacuate some more men back to the subs while coordinating for the rest of them to use native canoes to meet the submarines inside the sheltered lagoon on the opposite side of the island. They did link up with the submarines the following evening, after which they returned to Pearl Harbor. Tactically and operationally, the raid was a wash. No significant Japanese resources were destroyed. Afterwards, some historians speculate that the Japanese specifically reinforced Makin in places like Tarawa because of the raid, leading to the horrific battles to come. Strategically, though, the Marines were welcomed as heroes, celebrated in the 1943 film Gung Ho, released again in the middle of the war. And this raid achieved its strategic purpose of boosting American morale. But on a personal level, and this is where the story of tonight's lecture comes into it, in the chaos of the ordeal, no head count was taken of the raiders until they returned to Pearl Harbor. Only then did they realize that 30 of their comrades were missing. After the battle, accounts were able to establish that 21 of the Marines had been killed, their bodies left behind simply because it wasn't feasible to get them back to the submarines. Tragically, 9 others, including those 5 that volunteered to go back through the surf, were left behind during the withdrawal. Later, eyewitness accounts, including that of Lou Zamperini from the film, featured in the film Unbroken. Lou, in his prison cell, saw the names of the 9 inscribed there, and that was used to establish that they were eventually captured and executed by the Japanese. The comrades that survived the war lived with this reality, the reality that their brothers who had sacrificed everything had been left behind. And just ask you to imagine what that would be like to realize that the raid had withdrawn and that you were left behind, that you were one of those left. Their fellow Marines, some of them spent the rest of their lives trying to bring their fellow Marines home. And so with that, we're going to transition to the Zoom. And an Explorers Club member who decided to do something about that, Harry Brooks.
Thank you, Paul. And for all the devil dogs in the audience, Semper Fi. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I can't be here in person. But let me tell you a little bit about Explorers Club Flag 146. And by the way, I carried 146 on 3 separate expeditions. This is a story of a reef survey on a remote far Pacific atoll that had been damaged by two military operations, two invasions. The genesis of our expedition was actually in the fall of 1974, when as a young first lieutenant in the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines at Camp Lejeune. For those who stand the duty, you know it's 24 hours. And so in the middle of the night, one night, I was trying to stay awake, and I started rifling through the battalion history records, the archives, and I found out that 3-2 was the first battalion to land the Tarawa invasion in November the 20th of 1943. I kind of kept this in the back of my mind over the years. I always thought, I wonder what Tarawa looks like today. Well, 20 years later, I found out. I had joined the Explorers Club in 1993, went on a number of reef surveys, flag expeditions, and it dawned on me one night in some remote place, wonder what Tarawa looks like, and why don't we try to find out. In 1993, I carried flag 36, I believe, to Tarawa to do a reef survey, but found that Tarawa is an absolute ecological disaster. It gives sewage a good name. It's really, really pathetic. But the point being, the reef was so polluted, we couldn't do anything. We had one member of our expedition who actually lived on Tarawa by the name of a guy named Stan Gaggia, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But Stan lived on Tarawa, and he'd lived on Butaritari. And he said, if you want to see a real reef, go to Butaritari. We couldn't do that in 1993, but in 1997, we went to Butaritari. And I think Bob's got some slides, or is this when we're going to have the video?
Yes, and so now we're going to transit. Thank you for that, Harry. And Butari is also known as Makin, properly known as Butaritari. And so now we're going to transition to Bob's going to share some information about the flag expedition itself. All right.
Okay, full disclosure, Harry is a cousin of mine, and he's the reason I'm in the Explorers Club. He also knows how to draw on family members for free labor. And so he asked me to help with the logistics for the expedition that he was planning, and the logistics were a challenge. This island is out in the middle of the Pacific, and let's see.
220
skip ahead. First, I'm going to sort of wrap up what Paul did with an interesting video that they showed on ABC News the day that we were at the reinterment ceremony at Arlington.
It was 1997 when...
Yeah, apologize. Let me...
220 raiders had sailed by submarine to attack Japanese-occupied Butaritari Island, 2,400 miles southwest of Hawaii. Mission: divert attention from the U.S. invasion of Guadalcanal. The commandos killed 83 Japanese, but could not escape quickly. High surf pinned their rafts to the shore. 9 raiders were captured and later executed on another island. 19 men died in combat, and their bodies were left behind. Even so, the attack was so daring, it gave hope to Americans at a time when almost all the battles were being won by the Japanese.
Repeating the beginning, just because we know there's some Marines that need.
So anyway, this was a milestone in American history. It's been widely popularized and celebrated in the public media and entertainment. A lot of books have been written about it. And just as a side note, Wikipedia has about 5 articles on it that are very helpful if you want a general overview and quick history.
It was 1997.
And this that I'm about to show you, Bill Liss is an Explorers Club member, a celebrated Explorers Club member. He's an Air Force veteran. He is a board member at the Explorers Club for many years. And Bill interviewed Harry when Harry got back, and put together a terrific video that was distributed nationally by NBC to all of its local affiliates. And so I'm going to show that video because it's simply worth showing. Harry, in his lecture, is going to delve much deeper into these topics covered by Bill.
It was 1997 when Harry Brooks and a group of fellow explorers set off on an Explorers Club flag expedition to the small atolls in the Pacific. Their goal was to study the coral reefs, but a stop at the remote Makin Island would set off an extraordinary chain of events.
Just by happenstance, one of the members of our expedition found a skeleton in a shallow grave. We didn't know who it was, but we had some doctors on our team. They looked at the skeleton and determined by looking at the length of the femur that the deceased was probably at least 6 feet tall. So we determined that he was not a Japanese and was not a native.
Brooks drew a detailed map of where to find what the explorers uncovered, and he reached out to the Marine Raider veterans who got the military identification unit in Hawaii to go to Makin Island. They journeyed to the island, but returned after 5 days, telling Brooks and the Marine Raiders they found nothing.
I asked them where they looked, and they told me, and I said, "That's not where I told you to look." And they said, "There's nobody out there. We're out of funding. Too bad. It didn't work."
But Brooks and his fellow Marines were determined to find Sergeant Thomason and his lost comrades. They would not give up.
Went on a letter writing campaign to all the politicians, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the presidents, senators, anybody you could think of.
They succeeded, and they played a major role, along with native islanders, in what happened next.
They went back. I told them to take my map. I told them to look where we had found this particular skeleton. And they went back and they found all 19 of them.
2 years later, on August 17, 2001, 59 years to the day of Thomason's death, the Medal of Honor winner and 12 of his fellow Marine Raiders were buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. 6 others were buried in private family ceremonies.
Okay, so with that as a background, our expedition was not about body recovery or artifact hunting or finding lost remains. Harry obviously had a keen interest in this area and its history, but he's also an accomplished scuba diver and an explorer. And we were there. He assembled a team of largely divers to do a reef survey. He had found conditions intolerable when he tried to do a reef survey at Tarawa, and he made it a goal to go back to Butaritari, where Stan Gaja had pointed him. 4 years later, he realized that goal and assembled a team of people interested in underwater survey and diving like myself. And we went back on what was a flag expedition for flag number 146, and its stated goal was a reef survey. Harry asked me to handle a lot of the logistics for the trip. Butaritari is located in the middle of nowhere out in the Pacific. It's about 3 degrees north of the equator. There's a little matter of nomenclature that Wikipedia covers well. It was known as Makin Island during the war. It's now known as Butaritari. And once the main island became known as Butaritari, then the smaller island known as Little Makin got promoted, and it's now known as Makin Island. So, don't get confused on the maps. It was definitely Makin Island or Makin Atoll during World War II. And now there's another Makin Island that was just the little sibling that got a better title when Makin Atoll became Butaritari. Now, it turns out that what Harry had asked me to do is plan a trip that required 9,734 miles of travel. We went to Los Angeles, Hawaii, Fiji, Funafuti on a prop plane, and then Tarawa. But that was all pretty easy. Harry had navigated that travel before on commercial air. But the last 120 miles was the problem. Harry and I spent a number of months trying to figure out how are we going to get 13 expedition members lots of cases of water, a scuba compressor, and scuba tanks to the remote atoll of Butaritari. So we looked at flying, and as you can see, the Butaritari International Airport was not well used. There was rumored to be a small plane owned by a Chinese company that would intermittently fly in on some weeks. So that was not a possibility. We could have chartered a yacht. There are several yachts in that region of the world for charter. We couldn't afford that. And so we settled on a homemade, fairly unseaworthy, in my opinion, trimaran. And we chartered that. And when we got there and looked at it, Harry brought every member of the team to the trimaran and said, if you want to back out right now, there's no disrespect. But everybody stuck with the expedition. We then got to Butaritari, and everybody in this room should know, the government of Kiribati invites you to visit Butaritari. This is a guest house where we stayed. It is open to the public for a very reasonable rate, and Butaritari is an unspoiled, pristine part of the world. That's what it looked like when we got there. The beaches were beautiful, and we started out by scouting, taking notes on the land, the corals, the craters in the coral, what the coral regeneration was in the decimated areas from the battles. The locals are lovely people. They're sparse though. The island stretches over 12 miles long, but it's only a total landmass of about 5 square miles. There were about 3,000 people on the island, I think, when we were there, but you would think that there were only 20 because you just never didn't see people. Their houses were small thatch roof houses, dispersed through the woods. All right, so then it's time to go get in the water. So there we are headed out to start the reef survey. And if you look on the lower left, that is we were proud to have the only air compressor, scuba air compressor in that part of the world. That was our Bauer portable air compressor that I got a great deal on at the DEMA show in Las Vegas. There we are getting suited up to start the dive. And the reefs were fabulous. I've never seen anything like it. Now, I've never dove the Great Barrier Reef, so it may be similar. People rave about that. But me, being mostly a Caribbean diver, I had never seen anything like this reef. It was pristine, it was unspoiled, it was beautiful. It had giant clams that the crew, which is a local delicacy, the crew would swim down and reach their arm into the giant clam and cut meat out and bring it back up to feast on. I always wondered if some of those giant clams had skeletons hanging out of their mouth around the Pacific, and I think maybe they do. The coral reef was fabulous. That's pretty much it for the expedition, except I've got to tell a couple of quick war stories. The travel turned into a nightmare. Everything that Paul was saying about Carlson'S raid was just sending shivers up and down my spine about our travel experience because the weather turned on us. An unseasonable monsoon came unreasonably close to the equator. The equator is normally pretty safe from major storms. It's just the way the planet's atmospherics work. But that year, we were all surprised by a major storm system that moved very close to where we were. So what should have been a nice 20 hours cruise home turned into a nightmarish, Harry's reports, I just read it, said 34 hours. I could have sworn it was 42 hours, but it was miserable. We were getting slammed by rough seas. There were 30-foot seas the first night we tried to head home, and we got driven back to the lagoon. And at that point, some of the members were just getting despondent because they needed to get back to their jobs in the States. The next day, I remember sitting around, talking about a democratic decision process. Sort of a vote was taken. It's still miserable and dangerous out there. And some of them said, well, I've got to get back to my office or die trying. So we had to shove off into the storm. And for 34 or 42 hours, depending on whose version you want to go with, we were stuck most of the time in a miserable monsoon. And it was driving cold rain. The seas, they weren't 30-foot seas at the lagoon entrance the next day, but we were in steady 10s and 20s the whole way during big parts of the way home. Big waves would crash across the deck, and Paul was talking about unwashed, sweaty people crammed together below deck on the submarine. It was exactly that way on our little trimaran. And so I was put on my wetsuit, lashed myself to the deck, and went up for some fresh air at night. Michael Hilton, our expedition psychiatrist, came up in the middle of the night, miserable, glazed over eyes, and I said, Michael, if you're going to stay up here, you better lash yourself to the deck, because it is big waves that crash over every now and then. And he looked at me, and I swear you would have thought he was serious. He said, Bob, at this point, if I were to die, it would be a relief. And so anyway, we experienced the fickle, unpredictable weather of this part of the world. We experienced the huge surf. We actually aborted a dive on the windward side of the island because it was too dangerous, even though we were dying to get into that surf. But there was no medical evacuation. There was no medicine anywhere close. And so we had the luxury that the Carlson'S Raders did not have of getting to abort the plan, abort the dive, and turn away. So that's the expedition part.
Thank you, Bob. All right, so now we'll go back to the Zoom, please. And so with the kind of the clubs or the expedition's scientific portion covered, now we're going to transition to the discovery of the missing Carlson Raiders. So, Harry, how did you come across the remains of the lost Raiders?
Paul, when we got back to Atlanta, which backing up with what Bob was talking about, I call after the escape from Butaritari, I do have to mention one thing. The waves, they were rolling seas, and the waves were higher than the mast on the good ship Martha, which was our catamaran. And spinner dolphins would jump out of the waves and actually go over the boat. And it was almost like, it gave me cold chills. It was almost like a religious experience. But in any event, getting back, when I got back to Atlanta, I decided that I would give a call to the Fighting 69th, which is down the street from where you are today, the Army Guard. They were in Macon. They invaded Macon the same time the Marines invaded Tarawa. I also decided that I would call the Marine Radar Association to let them know that we'd found a skeleton. The Fighting 69th said that they were not missing anybody. But when I called the Radar Association, I got a hold of a fellow by the name of Don Harn. And Don Harn was a Marine at Macon, at Butaritari. At the time that I talked to Don, the Marine Radar Association was only made up of Marine veterans. It's not like it is today. But I asked Don if he was interested in hearing more, and he goes, well, you're damn right. And I started to explained to him what we'd found, and that we'd found a male skeleton who was probably about 6 feet tall. Don was very, very excited. He contacted his other Marine Raider veterans, and they got on the phone or got in contact with what I refer to as CILHI, the Central Identification Lab Hawaii. It's a different name right now. They've changed the name. We've got a hold of CILHI, and once we told them we had found a skeleton, they agreed to go to Butaritari and see what they could find. I told them, I said, take my map and talk to some of the locals, and you'll see at least where our our expedition members, Stan Gadget, had found the skeleton. The Marine Raiders were haunted literally by the fact that they had to leave their comrades behind. As Paul said, it's something that no military service ever wants to do. They always say, no one left behind. Silhai went to Butaritari and they spent a week. They came back and contacted Don and me and the other survivors and said, we didn't find anything. There's nothing there. You are, you had your chance. We're out of funding. There's nothing there. You had your chance. Well, that's not what you tell a Marine. We tried to prevail again. I asked him, did you look at the map? And he said, no. Kind of just literally blew me off. Well, Don and I and the others decided that we weren't going to let this stand. And about a year passed, and during that time, I went on a letter writing and political campaign where I literally wrote and called the Commandant of the Marine Corps, senators, congressmen, the president, anybody that I could think of, the Marine Museum and the Marine Historical Society. Finally, I believe it was Senator Paul Coverdale, God rest his soul, he was a Georgia senator. And I think he was really the guy that lit a fire under somebody. But suddenly, Silhai said, okay, we're going to go back. And this was sometime in late 1998, I believe, or 1999. Anyway, they went back. They took my map, and I volunteered to go back with them, but being a civilian, they couldn't have that. But in any event, they went back, and using my map and talking to some locals, they found all 19 missing Marines. This was obviously very, very good news to the survivors, and it prevailed. The Silhai prevailed. Well, actually, let me back up a little. They brought all of the remains back to Hawaii, identified the remains, and this was before DNA was really big. But in any event, they identified all of the remains, and 13 of the families agreed to have their loved ones interned at Arlington, and the other 6 were hometown or wherever.
So Harry,
Paul,
how did you learn that they had actually been found? Can you talk to us about what that experience was like?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
How did you learn that the lost Raiders had actually been found?
When Silhai contacted us, and they found graves. Some of the graves had, I think there were a few that had dog tags, buttons, belt buckles, and they also identified the remains at the lab in Hawaii, mostly using dental records.
And so then once the identifications had been found, had been made, you mentioned that they were interred at Arlington. Can you tell us about what? And some of you were invited to join that ceremony. Can you tell us about what that was like?
Yes, we were invited to join the surviving Raiders to go to the internment at Arlington. The night before the ceremony, they had a dinner, and it was a real honor to meet these guys. Several of them had been there, but several others, the Marine Raiders were involved in several other operations during World War II. Eventually, they were disbanded and made part of the 6th Marine Division. But at the dinner the night before, not only did I get to meet the survivors, but also the Commandant of the Marine Corps and a former Commandant by the name of P.X. Kelly, and there'll be a picture here in a minute of those two fellows.
And then,
But
go
ahead.
After the interment itself, there's one kind of happy. Well, I mean, that's a good ending. And then there was you were invited back here to New York City, right? Can you tell us about that aspect of the story?
Yes.
I want to point
as
out,
I mentioned earlier, we
Bob's wearing a
contacted
Fighting
the
69th.
Fighting 69th, and they have an annual Makin dinner. And Bob and I were invited to the Makin dinner with the Fighting 69th. And they had quite a dinner with a lot of Irishmen with Irish whiskey and champagne. But even better than that, Bob and I were invited to lead the St. Patrick's Day parade that is led by the Fighting 69th. And so little did I know after Butaritari that Bob and I would be walking down Fifth Avenue and leading the St. Patrick's Day parade.
So in one of my other roles, I'm a historian with the 69th. And so a year after the Carlson'S raid, the 69th led the Army amphibious assault that then
Yes,
seized
I'm
the
sorry,
raid.
yes.
And Bob here tonight is wearing a tie from the 69th, which we're proud to see. And so finally, I think we've got some slides to show from the Arlington interment. Bob, if you just want to advance through them there.
That's Harry and that is Jim Jones, Commandant of the Marine Corps.
So that's Jim Jones, the Commandant of the Marine Corps there. There's the Marines being carried by the Army caisson platoon.
Yeah, it was exceptionally impressive.
And this picture is
Solid.
really powerful to see all of them laid out there.
Today, the Marines gave their raiders a final resting place here at Arlington, 59 years to the day they staged their attack. The families and comrades said it was a fitting final tribute.
It was miraculous, I think, that they ever found them.
A footnote to a battle which helped America begin to believe it could win a war. John Martin, ABC News, Arlington National Cemetery.
And that is our report on World News Tonight.
And so I think at that point, so this is a certificate that was presented to Harry from the Marine Raders Association. And then this is Sergeant Clyde Thomason. Sergeant Thomason was killed in action during the assault, and he is the first enlisted Marine to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II, and was one of the bodies that Harry's expedition recovered.
And he's from Marietta, Georgia, which is right around the corner from Harry.
And then we kind of wanted to show this as the final visual for tonight. And I just invite everyone to read those names there. Those are the 19 Marine Raiders that Explorers Club Flag Expedition 146, led by Harry Brooks, brought home.
I'm going to come right back to that slide, but if anybody wants to see that memorial, it's over in Arlington in section 60 of gravesite 8036.
And while we transition to questions here, you note that there are 19, and I mentioned that there were 30 Marines lost during this battle. There are two Marines that were still missing in action somewhere on there. They were buried by the Japanese, and their graves have still not been located. And then the 9 that were left behind, that were still alive when they were left behind, and that were subsequently captured and executed. We know what island they were executed on, but their graves have not been located, so perhaps a future expedition. So with that, we're going to transition to questions now. And if we could bring Harry up on the screen, please. And then Bob's going to be over there, and I'll be here. And we'll now take questions. In the front row there, and Felix is going to bring a microphone. So if you raise your hand, Felix will bring the microphone.
Thank you very much. Can you say more about the 9 who were left behind?
Sure.
And my question about them specifically is, do we know had they been injured also, or can you just say more about the 9?
Sure. So the question is about the nine that were left behind that were still alive. So 5 of them were from that crew that made it back on the first night. And they had volunteered to go back and to try to reestablish communications. And if it wasn't for them, for their efforts, the remaining, there were 222 total, and about 40 made it back the first night. And if it wasn't for those 5 that went back, there would have been 100 and, I don't want to do public math in here, but it had been a much larger group left behind and captured. The second group, it's not really clear what happened to them, but what I would suggest that you take away from that was just the chaos on the island. It was all combat is chaotic, but what really made this battle distinctive was the surf, those treacherous surf conditions that Bob described experiencing on the expedition itself. And when they tried to come back at the end of that first night, they just got their worlds rocked, and it just turned into a complete kind of Charlie Foxtrot and that speaks to the lack of accountability until they got back to Pearl Harbor. Great question. And when you get the mic, just please, it's old equipment. Hold it up close, please.
In speaking with the tumultuous surf that the Marines faced on this raid, what was the train up for the Marines going into said raid? And then was there expectations, or going back to the train up, was the Marines' first encounter with the submarine was actually when they're coming on board, or were they aware of the logistics of docking Marine, cargo net down, here's our raider raft coming to the shore, and was that shore training available?
So the Raiders, when they were formed, 2 very distinct, there was an East Coast battalion and a West Coast battalion, and they're very distinct commanders, very distinct training methodologies. Carlson was all about this Gung Ho, and it was indoctrination. So he really emphasized marksmanship, they did train in the rubber boats. The rubber boats were key to this, and they had unreliable outboard engines. But you saw those rubber boats in one of the earlier slides. They trained extensively in the rubber boats. But the night of the battle, there was an unseasonable or unforecasted shift in weather, and they had to make a call. Do we do this at all, or do we call the whole thing off? And they decided to try, despite the sea state not being really being outside of what their risk assessments told them that they were willing to do. And the original plan, what they had practiced on, was to stow the rubber boats on the outside of the submarines and some of the torpedo tubes, and then they would get it all on deck and inflate them and load the boats and then submerge the submarines. But the sea state was so much that wasn't practical. So they made a kind of on-the-spot call to lower the boats off the side. They didn't have cargo nets. So they were just jumping from the deck of the submarine in 10-foot seas down onto the rubber boats. And if any of you have ever tried to swim with combat gear on, you can't. No one drowned. Several men did fall in, and their comrades grabbed them and were able to haul them into the rubber boats. Nobody drowned during the loading. Good question. Next.
Wouldn't it have been better just to wait out a couple of days or a day or two for the weather to improve?
It's a good question, and far be it for me to back judge the decisions they made. but you got to put them in the perspective of they are deep inside Japanese waters. They are on 2 submarines, what's the water quality like there, Bob? Can you see pretty far down? Oh, yeah. Yeah. And they are on 2 submarines, and the submarines don't have the endurance to just loiter in that area. So,
the organization that you'd worked with out of Hawaii that had identified the remains initially, was that like a predecessor or affiliated with the Palmia Accounting Agency?
Harry, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can't off the top of my head know what Silhai was renamed, but yeah, it's the group that goes around the world looking for remains of missing Americans.
And Annette, you have a connection with that group in the Korean War, right?
Actually, I don't need the microphone. I can project.
If you can use the mic just for, we do have a...
yeah, forget that he can't hear me. Yeah, so the POWMIA accounting agency today is what Silhai was combined into JPAC, and then in 2015 was combined to create this organization, DPAA, as we know it today. And I was on the Korean War team in between my Marine Corps and Navy service. And that leads to a question I was going to ask was, how much cooperation did you get from the local populace, and did they know that they had remains buried? I know that in some expeditions that the I used to work for actually had the native population that knew where these were, that were just like, we're waiting for you to come ask us. I was just curious if they were as aware that those graves were there.
Harry, do you want to take that?
Yes, I don't know why on the first trip they didn't take the map, and I don't know why they didn't speak to the locals, or if they did, they spoke to the wrong ones, obviously. But when they went back, they did find a local who, as a young boy, helped the Japanese bury the Marines. But they were there where Stan had found the skeleton.
And that's a great point as well, and that there's aspects of this particular discovery that are like a lot of discoveries, where what was being discovered was Western knowledge discovering what people knew there. The interesting wrinkle in that, though, is that the witness who helped the Japanese, it's the 2 Japanese graves that are still missing. Yeah, all right, next question. I also want to just, again, recognize Annette for being here. The Explorers Club at its best is a meeting place for explorers. And that woman could give a lecture in her own right about incredible expeditions, so please make sure you talk to her after this. And thank you for coming tonight, Annette.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the lecture. It's been captivating so far. My question was, it sounds like this was kind of the first operation of its type back in World War II. I guess, did the lessons the Marines learned on Makin kind of have a big influence on the future operations in the Pacific throughout the war?
Absolutely. And so one of the main takeaways for any of you who are in the military now, one of the main innovations that came from this was the 3-element squad. The original configuration, it had a platoon had 2 sections of 2 squads each, and each squad had 2 teams. And due to space constraints, they got rid of the section echelon, and they ended up fighting. And this was seen as proving that the optimal combat formation was 3 sub-elements. There were a number of lessons, but one of the things that's kind of coolest when you look back on this is this truly was the first American special operations conducted. So, great question. Next. And we got time for probably 2 more questions, including this.
So in terms of the, I know you guys were diving originally to understand the reef. What was the ecological impact of the war on the reef itself? And a second part of that was, how would the conditions of the reef at the time, because obviously you were kind of trying to predict that or backdate that, how would those have affected the operation itself?
Bob or Harry, which one of you would like to take that? Bob.
Go ahead, Bob.
Well, okay. So the conditions of the reef at the time, and Harry's flag report is on file here at the club. It was encouraging that the reef had done an amazing, to me amazing job of recovering, rebounding from the trauma that it had suffered. These are hard corals and they're slow growing, but after this amount of time, there would seem to be nothing that was impeding their growth rate. So they were filling in crater holes and the coral was thriving, and less evidence of what had been there. And then your next question was?
How did the reef initially affect the operations of how the Raiders would have landed or where they chose to?
Yeah, so from the military perspective, they chose to come in from the windward side instead of the lagoon side in order to have an element of surprise. And they kind of abandoned that once they realized they were not going to be able to make it out the windward side.
Yeah, and from a practical point of view, I've actually spent a lot of time doing exploration dives on the island of Bonaire, which is 12 degrees north of the equator. And it has a windward and leeward side, and you simply cannot dive the windward side when the surf is up. It's deadly and it's brutal because the waves are crashing against the coral that has survived thousands of years of crashing waves. So it's jagged and strong. And so this weather change was disastrous. And if things hadn't worked out where they could have made that exit through the calm lagoon, if they hadn't taken out enough Japanese that they could safely just use the more exposed lagoon exit, a lot more would probably still be there.
To give an idea of the surf conditions, the submarines had to run with their engines fully engaged just to maintain their positions to load and offload. All right, any other questions? All right, at this point, we'll wrap up. And I want to start by thanking Bob Killoran and Harry Brooks. The Explorers Club is a meeting place for explorers, and they are an example of some of the best people I've ever met at the club. I met Bob after a lecture here, I think?
It was.
Yeah, after a lecture here, and the bar was closed downstairs. Thankfully, it's not tonight. But one of my West Point classmates, Dennis Clancy, had left. He was a member. Had left a bottle here, and Bob asked if he could have some from that, and I was sure. And that led to, and Bob had to say, like, I know the fight in 69th, and that turned into all this. So you never know who you're going to meet and the stories you're going to hear here at the Explorers Club. We do also have, as a special event for tonight, the bar will remain open till about 10 o'clock tonight. And while it's a members-only bar, your admission tonight gets you guest privileges for tonight, so you can purchase at the bar. I want to thank the folks who have run tonight's event, particularly Felix, who did a lot of the groundwork here. Luis, standing back there by the AV, I got involved with the club about 10 years ago when the Army first stationed me here in New York, and Luis was one of the people who really went out of his way to make me feel welcome here and to encourage me to do more things to recognize the military parts of the club's legacy. So thank you, Luis. Tonight's event is in part because of you. But as a special thing, we're trying to make these lectures fun and engaging. Please keep coming back every Monday night, and to make this one fun and engaging, so you hear the connection between the Raiders and the Fighting 69th. American Legion 754 has worked with the regimental headquarters of the Fighting 69th to do a special toast to the Raiders. And we've got Chris, so how do we want to pass out the toasts?
Where are we going to do it?
Right in here.
Give us a few minutes to form.
All right, so right after this, there's going to be a toast to the Marine Raiders. And so Chris, the master bottler back there, is going to be passing these out. And then the last thing is, if you're interested in getting one of these cool bottle armor things, you can make a contribution to the American Legion. They're $45, and they come with a neat free thing that goes with it. And so I just want to finally say, wish everybody a happy Memorial Day. Thank you for coming tonight. And to me, and there's a lot of great military-connected legacy in the club, but this is kind of the height of the club. This is people like Bob and Harry coming together to do scientific explorations that are, I think, out of all the accomplishments that the club's expeditions have achieved, few have done more to kind of live up to the legacy of those 19 lost on the original Greeley expedition. And I have to think that General Greeley and First Sergeant Brainerd and all of those kind of founding members of the club would be proud of what Flag 146 accomplished under Harry Brooks' leadership. So a final round of applause for Bob and Harry. Thanks, and stand by for the toast.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to sign off here.